Hi, welcome to our YouTube channel, Addiction Pal. I am Logan.
And this is Nate. Uh, this is Emerging from the Rabbit Hole, part two of our pilot episode. And we got feedback from some listeners about our first episode. And so today we were wanting to give a little more space to breathe, a concept about whether rape is mystical. So we want to kind of dig into that because I mentioned it offhand that rape seemed like this mystical transformation that happened to people, and there was some question about the word choice, and so I guess I want to start out by saying that for me, and I think on this podcast in general, words are important. Wouldn't you say, Logan?
Oh, absolutely.
So I think we ought to be very careful with the words that we choose to use, and I think I'm kind of a philologist in terms of loving language, and I think Logan is as well. So we always are interested in hearing feedback about the words that we use and how we can better choose to use some words. And so I guess if we're really going to address the question of is rape mystical, we ought to know what those words actually mean. So I understand there's some contention about what mystical is, but I would almost wonder whether people actually know what the word rape means. So what
Let's
is your
start there
sense?
first. Yeah, so if we, as you said, the word in contention seemed to be mystical, but why don't we start with the basics and really make sure we cover all the bases clearly. So definition of rape. If you ask me what rape is, I would say assaulting someone in a sexual manner or ravaging something from something. Like, I don't know. I guess I've heard the word rape used outside of sexual context before in things like
Like rape and pillage.
Yeah, although rape and pillage I think typically means, you go pillage the village and rape the women, right?
I
But
don't know if that's what it means. I again,
that's how I took it for what it meant, I guess.
yes, I think that something that we've talked about off air is maybe we should point out that I don't have any degrees in English. I graduated from high school in Ohio, so good for me there. But I'm not really sure that I have any prestige or credentials when it comes to the use of the English language. And I think that I'm pretty comfortable at this point saying that I don't even speak English. Maybe, well, we talk about English dialects, right?
Right,
And
right.
there's a good amount. So words matter, but in different dialects, different words mean different things. And I think this is going to be a recurring theme for you and I. But yeah, it seems like the people have these different dialects that they use, and there's some sort of I don't know, discrimination against certain dialects that they're thought of as not very good English or something. But the truth is, we all have our own idiolect. Idio meaning peculiar to oneself, like idiot. So I have my own idiot dialect that's just peculiar just to me, and uh, so I speak that language, and I don't claim to speak English, and in fact I don't think that English as it's used by a lot of my peers is a very good language in general. So why would I even want to speak it? So I speak my own language, and it means its own things, and that makes communication difficult. But I like to think that I speak a language that's better than English. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that in my own idiolect that I care about is old meanings of words. I care a whole lot about etymology. It's kind of like what a word has looked like throughout its whole journey, rather than just judging the word as it shows up on my doorstep today. I want to hear about its whole life experiences. And so I think that when I look up the word rape in Merriam-Webster, I see that it's an archaic usage of the word rape is to seize and take away by force. Now, of course, it's archaic in the English language. It's perfectly acceptable in Nathan's language for me to use rape as a meaning to take away. And in particular, I like that usage of the word for things like rape and pillage, right? That I can take what I want and destroy the rest or whatever.
Right.
But it also helps me to understand other things. So the first time I ever heard the usage of the word rape to mean to take away was in art history class. I heard about the rape of the Sabine women. And in particular, there's a sculpture by Giambologna. I don't know if I got that right. And it's a important piece. It's an interesting sculpture in its own right, and I encourage you to check it out because it really takes advantage of the fact that it's a sculpture and that you can view it from all these angles, and these bodies are twisted in this scene where a man is taking a woman away, and so the way that the forms are twisted, it really encourages you to walk around the sculpture, and so that really shows that the advantage of a sculpture over a painting, that you can see all these different angles as their bodies contort. But I think it describes this historical or mythological event in Roman history where Rome went to these the Sabines and stole all of their marriageable women and took them back to Rome to marry. And so this kind of seems to be a situation where you kind of blend the meanings of the word, right?
Right.
Because no one really thinks that they went to these cities and committed a sexual violation on the spot with all these women. As more of it's some sort of like conquest, and they bring them home, and so sex is related, but not the principal act of rape here. Does that make sense?
Yes, like you said, it's a blend of the two things. It's
so it seems to me
yeah.
that it seems that I don't know, that's the way that I am able to understand these two uses of the word, and I would encourage people in their own idiolect that they allow their vocabulary to grow in certain ways, because if I were to have been really hard-headed when I heard the description of the rape of the Sabine women, I would have said, hey, this isn't rape, you shouldn't call it rape, we should take rape seriously, whatever. When in fact there's this whole historical usage of the word rape that really adds a whole nother level to the word. And I really like that some words have multiple meanings and you can kind of blend their meaning in that way. To me, it allows for some poetry.
So basically, the argument is in your, as you put it, your idiot language, which I think is a funny way to say it.
It's only funny if you don't understand the origin of idiot, which is meaning peculiar to oneself. I think
sure.
that would also be, yeah.
Yeah, but that's so for you, taking the words of their original meaning or their archaic meanings and learning how to attribute that to modern day dialect or your idiolect, is something that you enjoy and something that you think is better, more organized, structured, and has more possibilities. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, going off of what you just said, if you know what the root idio means, then idiolect, or the idiot language, makes perfect sense if you understand what that means. But somebody who doesn't understand the root of idio and just hears idiot language, they would assume it's a synonym for stupid language, which is why, to me, it sounds kind of funny. After your explanation, I understand both.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that people think idiot and think it means a stupid person. And now I understand that idio, such as idiosyncrasy or something like that, means like your own, designated for you.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that maybe another word you used to describe rape was ravage, right?
Yes.
And it turns out that ravish actually has very similar ideology to rape, that they both go back to the same word.
Oh, really?
In Latin, rapere, and it also has the same root as the word rapid. Now, how is rapid associated with rape? Well, if you think of rapere is to carry away, aren't rapids of a current carrying things away?
Oh, yeah.
That's a place where it's very easy for the current to seize something and move it along, capture it for itself.
Right, right.
And then, of course, you can get, the rapids are also moving quickly, and therefore you get rapid, meaning swift or something, right?
Yes.
But it all goes back to this rapidus seizing, rapere to seize these. So it seems to me like if you give up on these archaic meanings of words and you don't see how they're connected, that rape and this particular part of the river and to ravish, they all have this common home and they're all related, they're all cousin words, and yet if you talk to a contemporary English speaker, they would assume that there's no relation with these words. Now, right. I guess this can also, we can set that on its side for a little bit. But now let's talk about the word mystical. So I think you were saying that there's a connotation, if not a denotation, of mystical being like good, having a good association, like it's magical.
Right. I think in the contemporary dialect, well, not the contemporary dialect, there are several dialects. It is often taken for something positive or fantastical, which we'll get to later. But yes, go on.
So I guess when I look up the dictionary definition of mystical, I'm seeing that it has a spiritual component or something that's mysterious or unintelligible. And I guess that was the sense that I really meant mystical, meaning like the opposite of intelligible, the opposite of rational. So there's no rational explanation for mystical things. Mystical experiences are kind of beyond our ability to understand or communicate. And I could have used other words like preternatural or occult, arcane. These are kind of synonyms in the same sense that I meant it. And yet, in my own attempt to communicate with contemporary English speakers, admittedly they speak a different language than I do, I was thinking mystical is a word that they already know, so maybe I'm using it in a slightly different way than what they know, but they will think it's more accessible than if I use a word like occult or preternatural or arcane, which would, in its own way, be a way to obscure what I'm saying. And I think, if anything, using a word like arcane, if anything, has a more specific meaning of magical, and you get off into the world of Harry Potter or Dungeons and Dragons or something like that.
Right.
At least that's where my mind goes when I hear arcane. I think of a video game or a fantasy story.
Because when you, I mean, for example, in the game World of Warcraft, there is a type of magic called arcane magic, and it's bright and colorful, and the video game itself is supposed to be entertaining and fun, and it's supposed to be, a fantastical experience. So yeah, I can definitely see why somebody who's played games would be averse to using the word arcane for a similar reason.
And so I guess I was going with more like mysterious, but even mysterious doesn't seem to have quite the punch that like mystical or occult or arcane seem to have. It seems like if I say, oh, rape is kind of mysterious, then I don't know, people almost have an association with that of being quaint or curious or something.
Yeah, in that sense, it's almost too neutral.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted, in terms of the mysticism, I wanted to invoke almost a religious context, maybe even a pagan context for our understanding of what the taboo really comes down to. That the how we treat things like virginity and the seizing of that virginity, it seems like it's almost a religious, inexplicable, everybody knows but no one can say why kind of experience, right?
Right.
And so I guess I was curious why mystical or magical necessarily has this like positive association. I know you were saying that in World of Warcraft, the arcane is colorful.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I think that there might be something else going on in the entire genre of fantasy, where you kind of replace science with magic. So I guess, so what is the appeal exactly of that?
So, well, from a writer's standpoint, I can say that when writing fantasies, I've written several short stories and poems and fantasy setting. You can ignore science, like you just said, and replace it with magic. So there's a lot less research you have to do.
Right.
However, one would argue that where there's less research to do for the science, there's maybe more research to do in your head to kind of find a way to explain the impossible through impossible means themselves. But it also could be kind of considered a cop-out. Like, I don't know how this works, so I can just call it magic. And and I think there is something desirable about the impossible and being in a different world. And as I said before, a lot of these fantastical places are attractive. They use vibrant colors often. There's creatures that don't exist, like dragons or things in folklore and stuff that sound interesting and exciting. Perhaps there's the feel of adventure, of trying to get something that is impossible to have. So I'd say there's several attractive qualities to a fantasy. And I think if we want to get back to etymology again, when we think about something that we desire, we often call that fantasizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So fantasizing, meaning, fantasy. I don't have all the etymology in front of me, but pretty sure those are roots of each other.
Yeah, so I guess I'm curious, because if the mystical is the unexplainable, it seems like I don't understand how to understand the mystical. Like, it's by definition impossible.
Right, because the definition of mystical is neither apparent to the senses nor obvious to the intelligence. So in other words, mystical is by definition something that you cannot comprehend with the senses. And when I just described something that's a fantasy, it is almost the opposite. It is very vibrant, very, very real to the senses. And perhaps it's an illusion because it's not real, but it is definitely perceivable through the senses and inhabitable. Right.
I guess. I don't know how to discern between a fantasy and just a non-experience. But
right. So so since a fantasy is comprised of things that don't exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could say, what's the point? And if you want to say, what's the point of going to somewhere like that? You could say, well, it's fun, but is it really fun if you can't bring anything back to reality once you leave the fantasy world? So let's say you dive into a book and it's a fantastical journey. Say you're reading Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, and let's just stick with Harry Potter. You go to Hogwarts and you feel like you're right alongside Harry and Hermione and Ron, and you're going through Hogwarts learning spells and learning the quote unquote science behind magic, which it's magic, it's not real. There's nothing you can actually use to apply to reality in those senses anyways. So by the time you close the book and re-immerse in reality, what have you gained from it? And perhaps you are happy while you are reading the book. Perhaps some of that lingers after you've read the book, but what really, how does that impact your life henceforth?
It seems like the premise of fantasy is pursuing the unreal. If we're talking about etymology, you also have phantasms, illusions, right? As the same root.
Right.
And so mystical being associated with like illusions, I don't know why would you choose deliberately to pursue the illusory, the unreal? Like this, we know it's a lie.
Right. So if you know something is a lie, why would you chase after it? It's kind of like if you're watching a magician and it's only when you watch a magician, it's only fun when you're being fooled. If you know how the trick works, there's nothing exciting to watch.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what's the point if you already know going into it that it's not real? I think, and we talked about this. Go ahead.
Interestingly, we bring up magicians because one of the big critics of fantasy is I remember watching an interview with Penn and Teller, and it was really, it seems like their show is about skepticism. It's about calling bullshit. And so interestingly, they have a really negative view on the escapism associated with Lord of the Rings, among other things. That why in the world are people running away from reality? And these are people who professionally perform illusions, but their whole thing depends on illusions, and yet they are encouraging people to be skeptical and see through illusions, right?
Right.
So it seems interesting that these so-called magicians are actually very against magic.
Yes, exactly.
And so what is the appeal of escapism?
Right. So the real question is, why do you have a need to entered the fantasy to begin with. And I think that could be grounds for its whole entire podcast in itself.
Right. Okay. But it seems like there's some interest that people have in getting away, and you know, a lot of my peers, it seems like it's in more whether it's sports or nerdy things, escaping into some superhero world or Dungeons and Dragons or something like that. It's a kind of rejection of the world that we live in, right? The world that we live in is somehow less than desirable. Now, interestingly, we were talking a little bit about mysticism. Let's go back to some religion. So, in terms of religion, there is a certain branch, even of some so-called Christians, who have this fascination with the rapture. Are you familiar with the rapture?
Yes, the way I put it earlier was when God kills everybody and lets some go to heaven.
Okay, all right. So the idea is that these chosen people will be taken away by God, and they will be taken from this horrible earth and taken to a better place, right there. And so you have some people who want to forecast the rapture, and so they I don't know, pay very close attention to spiritual sources for the exact date and time that the rapture will happen, and they never. Sometimes they come up and they never happen, and who knows. Some cults who pursue rapture type thinking, they choose to commit mass suicide because they're leaving for a better place, right? This is maybe the most literal version of escapism, right?
Yes.
And yet, I'm kind of skeptical that that where they're going and what they're doing is such a good idea. I'm not a rapture person myself, but it is interesting to note that the etymology of rapture is also rape. A rapture is when God rapes you into heaven, comes and he steals you away.
Mind blown.
So in that sense, I think rape is this mystical transformation that moves you to a new place.
It is in the etymology itself.
So I think that my concern is that rape doesn't actually bring you to a better place, and that I don't want you to be stolen away. I want to continue to relate to you. But I think that it's very common in our culture for people to think of rape as this mystical, unintelligible, arcane transformation that no one understands, no one can explain, and yet we still believe it. And I guess I'd rather side with the magicians who call BS and think that we ought to be skeptical that such a magical transformation never actually occurs. Maybe this is all just a phantasm in our minds and not such a profound metaphysical change in someone. It might just be that rape in all of its forms is just a really lousy thing that happens, but it's real, it's not supernatural, and it's not beyond a human's ability to address it.
Or recover from it.
Or even understand it.
So, and this kind of picks up on last week's episode as well. tying this together with why the episode titled this week is Rape Mystical. If you declare that it is not, by the definitions that we laid out already, who does that hurt the most? By trying to determine rape as this mystical thing, basically as society views it now, all that really does is hurts the victims, right?
It hurts a lot of people. It seems like it only helps the people who are too uncomfortable to want to have the conversation in the first place.
Yeah, and avoiding any sort of conversation in the first place really impedes any sort of improvement for the situation. And by the situation, I don't just mean a specific rape case. I just mean the situation of how society is addressing rape in general.
Right.
Like the issue of taboo,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, I think that whole treating rape as this mystical thing, this taboo thing that we can't talk about and we can't understand, it hurts the victims. It hurts the people whose lives it destroys based on rumor. It causes a whole lot of injustice just because we're not comfortable thinking or talking about a particular subject.
I would like to add one more bit to this issue, since basically this episode was almost entirely dedicated to clearing up some things in the last episode and kind of trying to bring everything full circle. Is that another criticism that we got in the previous episode was some sort of credibility issue, as like, you're two white guys, you come off like insensitive, and that how would we know anything about this? For example, we've never been raped, and we are men talking about women primarily, even though, once again, let me reiterate, at some point I do want to talk about gender roles in this. And I would like to say that everything that we said in the previous episode was backed by experiences from when we talk to other people or other sources, but we're not explicitly saying all these things, especially because, for example, I've talked to women who have been raped before. I do not want to say what their names are or explicitly their stories or anything, because I want to keep their identity protected, which is odd and maybe contradictory to our entire overarching point of that they shouldn't have to feel that way. But I think it's up to them if they want to tell that story or not. It's not up to me. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is we're not completely just barfing out stuff. We have a reason for what we're saying. And this was thought out before we just started spewing random tidbits here and there.
Yeah, I guess in the same vein as me saying that I don't speak English, so good luck trying to correct me in terms of my use of the language. I guess I don't care much for facts, data, these sorts of things. So basically everything that I say is my opinion. I figure that should be kind of self-evident because it's coming out of my mouth, but these are things that I think. And unless I'm citing someone else, and then I guess it's what they think. Is that what it is?
I guess so. You know.
So I don't know how to cite a fact anymore. I've given up on that. So I'd rather just live in a world with opinions, whether they're good opinions or bad opinions. You could be the judge.
So another little bit that I think we could do a full podcast on sometime would be how actually we did make a cast about this. We just haven't published it yet about how about why we are emerging from the rabbit hole. And like we've said, Lewis Carroll is a big influence of ours. And this is for more than one reason. One is because of how logical he is and how much he plays with logic in his story Alice in Wonderland, which is where emerging from the rabbit hole comes from. Instead of falling down the rabbit hole to go into Wonderland where it's nonsensical, we are emerging from it into, hopefully, a world of logic. And he's also a master of wordplay, which, as we were talking about before, we're talking about etymology and the use of words and why the use of words is important. And you talked about an idiolect, and how there's different dialects that emerge and evolve and change, and how it's important to recognize old meanings of words and be able to kind of use them interchangeably with new meanings of words. Would you say that's fair? Would you agree with that?
Isn't that poetry? Playing with words?
Yeah, I was going to say wordplay as well. But poetry, yes, that's a better way to describe it. And
I guess playing with words to me is kind of playing with words well is poetry.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I guess I was getting caught up in connotation again, whereas playful sometimes seems to like it's supposed to be silly or funny, but that's not necessarily true. And
I guess I was thinking more in terms of
malleable,
like Play-Doh.
Yeah, and this entire the entire point of our cast is to focus on that kind of overarching theme of wordplay and logic, where they intersect, how we can play with that and explore these deep concepts, and hopefully, enlighten people, or at least get people to think, get their gears turning, and come up with their own conclusions, right?
Yeah.
So I think that could be a whole cast for another time. As I mentioned earlier, I think escapism could be a whole cast for another time. If anybody who's listening right now would like to hear more about escapism or about why we chose emerging from the rabbit hole, we are very open to comments, or if you have anything that you'd like to input about anything said in this cast or the previous cast, let us know. If you haven't seen the previous cast yet, go ahead and check it out. It is on our channel Addiction Pal, and we will be recording another episode next Thursday.
Awesome.